So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Research Week 2022's Community-Based Research Spotlight session. We wish to acknowledge that the campuses of Algoma University are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Mushkegowuk Cree, as well as hereditary lands of the Métis Nation. We also acknowledge that many of us are joining from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, home of the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, on sacred land set aside for education as envisioned by Chief Shingwak for our children and for those as yet unborn. As today's session is being held virtually, we would also like to acknowledge all the Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, whose lands and territories we are each situated on. So a few housekeeping items to note: that this session, as I mentioned, is being recorded and will be linked to the auresearchweek.com website under the Research Spotlight section, which you'll find at the top. Participant cameras and microphones are off today. Only hosts and panelists have camera and mic access. If you run into any audio issues during the webinar, please try another method of listening in, such as computer audio or calling in by phone. The chat and Q&A functions have been disabled at this time. However, after each presentation, we will re-enable the Q&A so that our audience can participate. We will follow up on questions as time permits. Otherwise, a follow-up email will be shared. Live captions are included and have been enabled. If you are a member of the media, please reach out via chat to set up an interview with our speakers or the Office of Research. So I'll introduce our first speaker for today. So Dr. Inderpal Kaur. Today's session will begin with a presentation from Inderpal on economic reconciliation with Indigenous communities in Ontario, issues and challenges ahead. Inderpal has been a part-time instructor at Algoma University in economics since 2019. Welcome, Inderpal.
Thank you. Very good morning to all the panelists and all the attendees. And it's my privilege to be the part of the second research week as initiated in the Algoma University. And it's an inspiration and an effort to be connected and innovating together for the research and for the betterment of all Canadians. I really acknowledge my position as community-centered, non-Indigenous educator and researcher. And I'm a racialized immigrant, but I truly, really acknowledge and respect the Indigenous communities and all the Canadians. And I want to serve with my knowledge and path to learn and play my role in the process of reconciliation, particularly from the economic perspective and the social realities together, and how Canadians can envision nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and Indigenous nations and communities. There are treaty relationships, agreements, and state versus states, and honoring treaty relationships and economic relationships. All these go hand in hand. And we all know that Indigenous people, they are not homogeneous as such. The realities and the challenges in the nations, they are diverse, and it's an effort. It's a humble effort to identify, and therefore perspective also cannot be one. The focused interest of my talk is economic reconciliation in Canada, challenges and solutions. And this is community-based, which could help in cross-cultural learning. It also, I think that would be helping in interconnecting relationships with people, places, and the physical environment, which is so important, along with in a very subtle way, touching the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of human beings through knowledge build-ups. Although I don't have any inhibition to accept that it's my beginning in the area, but I'm not new to the community-based research because my earlier publications, they are there on the social economic aspects, on the human resource development indexes and the social dimensions of the community-based research. Here in the beginning, I would like to read the quote: investing in Indigenous peoples is an investment in Canada's future prosperity, and full reconciliation with Indigenous people will not happen without economic reconciliation. And it is not only the fair and right thing to do, but there is a strong, compelling business case for all Canadians. And this is quote by Don Madabi, who is a chairperson of the board and general manager of the Business Development Corporation, National Indigenous Economic Development Board in 2016. When I say, and I'm reading the statement and the quote, it says for all Canadians. And here I would like to add one of my economic concept, that's dualism. And when dualism is, it can be economic dualism, it can be social dualism, and it can be technological dualism, when one part of the society or economy is advanced and the other one is not. So therefore that becomes a kind of the inhibition in the road to socio-economic development of the country and nation. So therefore, when all the people are empowered and their issues are resolved, simultaneously efforts are made. So that is really socio-economic development of the society. Providing equal economic opportunity for Indigenous people will help Canada address the ongoing economic challenges caused by low productivity and demographic changes from the aging population. Again, it's the saying of Chief Terence Paul, board member and chief of member First Nation, and this includes equal access to education and training and economic opportunities more broadly, from access to new jobs, equal employment conditions, to resources and starting a new business, whatever requirements are there for that. The next slide is the definition, although we all know and familiar with, but I thought that as the students might also be the part whenever they are listening and having an access to this recordings. So the term Aboriginal or Indigenous is used in Statistics Canada website, which refers to individuals identifying themselves as First Nations people, Métis or Inuit. Indigenous populations in Canada are the original inhabitants of the land that is now Canada and have been here more than 14 years. And more than 1.67 million people in Canada, that is 4.9% of the population of Canada, is self-identified as an Indigenous person as per Canada's 2016 census of population. Going into more details and introducing the aspects, Indigenous people are the fastest growing population in Canada, with a population that grew by 42.5% between 2006 and 2016. And Ontario has the largest concentration of Indigenous people. Six Nations of the Grand River is the largest reserve in Canada, with over 21,000 members, and over 60% of the national Indigenous population lives in urban areas. There might be something here and there with the data, although I borrowed it from the reliable sources and Statistics Canada. But if there are certain deviations in the things, I would be correcting them if at all something is there. Ontario is home to 23% of all indigenous people in Canada. There are 133 First Nations communities located across Ontario, representing at least 7 major cultural and linguistic groups. These communities are located from Windsor in south to the northern shores of Hudson Bay. 5 of the 20 largest bands in Canada are located in Ontario, with Mohawks and 6 Nations being the largest. Over 30 First Nations in Ontario are considered remote, accessible only by air, year-round or ice road, or for much of the years. Then having some more information on the Ontario state as such, there are more remote First Nations in Ontario than in any other region, urban centers with significant Indigenous populations. There are Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins, Ottawa, and Toronto. And the recent pandemic infection rate also for Indigenous peoples in Toronto is also 23% higher than that of the city's general population, according to the data. Indigenous people in Toronto have been hospitalized with COVID-19 at more than 3 times the rate of the general population in the city, according to a preliminary data provided exclusively to the STAR. Just reminding that the database and methodology for all of my talk and the kind of an effort for the research in the area has been, it's a secondary sources, no primary data collection, and I rely on whatever available data sources and literature are available, and reviewing them and trying to build up the narrative for my today's talk, as well as if I am given an opportunity and I have all the whatever research I intend to do in future. The objectives of this study, that is again the existing literature methodologies, to analyze them and build the future direction of community-centered research in the area. Secondly, to analyze economic and social correlation and policy implications in the context of economic reconciliation. And of course, as a researcher and analyst, I'll be critically overviewing, and suggestions and policy implications and conclusions would be hence put forward. First, I start with the sections of this talk. The first part is devoted to reconciliation, its meaning, origin, and importance of the term. And here I would like to emphasize that it is important to differentiate between reconciliation from the Canadian state perspective and how Indigenous communities view this relationship and process. And at the end of the talk, I would be referring to certain Indigenous researchers who have more to say about this reconciliation. But first, I would be going into details of my sections as devoted and narrative. Then secondly, economic reconciliation, its theoretical postulates, concepts, build-ups like features, process, and methods. And social economy forms a part of the study as a solution-based approach. Its significance and meaning in the present context. Then the Community Wellness Index, which has been calculated to analyze the gaps between the Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. So I'll be talking about Community Wellness Index, its findings, its limitations, and further things regarding that. Then, of course, the last part of the talk would be conclusions, solutions, and policy implications. And here I would like to emphasize that solutions, of course, they are not as such straightforward, but they have to be the part of the broader policy framework. So when I come to that, I will be just mentioning a little parts into that. First, I start with the reconciliation, because all the time we are repeating this concept, how it started and what is the definition. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it was set up in 2008 to document the effects of residential schools on Indigenous people, and it defines reconciliation as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. The process of reconciliation and its some of the features. The Government of Canada, in consultation with Indigenous community members, has established permanent, has to establish permanent bilateral. Of course, the beginning has been made, but the progress has to be there. Permanent bilateral mechanisms and relationships with First Nations, Inuit and Métis Nation leaders to identify the following. Number one, the joint priorities of both the sides, stakeholders, then co-developing the policy. And of course, whenever a policy is initiated and introduced, its progress has to be monitored so as to plug the loopholes or whatever shortcomings are there, to have more progressive view in future, wherein everybody in the stakeholder, the parties, they benefit from it. It describes attempts made by individuals as well as institutions to raise awareness about colonization and its ongoing effects on indigenous people. Reconciliation defies easy characterization. So we cannot just characterize it as such. It cannot be reduced to merely a strategy. It means broadly, number one, recognizing treaty rights, two, re-establishing political autonomy, three, revitalizing indigenous language and culture. And for it, it's a Professor Glado's definition of reconciliation, and he is, of course, a champion of talking about he's a prominent person in the field of study, and he gives 10 guideposts. Number one, language revitalization; two, co-production of policy; number three, reduce litigation; number three, infrastructure and service standards, they have to be maintained and made to be par with the other non-indigenous communities; equality, equal land claims, enabling investment in the areas required; then the procurement targets for entrepreneurs, for agriculturists, and all the people, indigenous communities who who can offer their and who can participate in the economic process as going on. Then justice reforms, whatever are required to uplift the communities, and the land management, of course, is also an essential part of the thing. Now, the next is applications of this concept of reconciliation, and whatever policy implications they can be there from it. So reconciliation must be embraced and not resisted. Any efforts on the part of the parties involved. So there should be the cooperation of all the parties involved, and it should not be resisted. It addresses the challenges of the past, but also sets a course that is good for all Canadians. It means the improvement, renewal, and revitalization of Indigenous lives. The task is formidable, but neither inexpensive nor easy. This means it's not very easy to do, and moreover, it involves a lot of resources and on economic resources and other inputs required to achieve this concept. In reality, it will bring in, but what it would be bringing in, it would be bringing in social and economic justice, and it should be the priority of every Canadian involved in this process to achieve this reconciliation as such. So what is there any hope for reconciliation? Yes, of course, there is. It's a very positive picture can be portrayed with the help of whatever left efforts have been made so far. And what are those outcomes which are very heartening? Reconciliation Canada and educational institutions, which involves schools and universities, they had increased their efforts towards this process, which is so desired and which is so required. And it is done through more dialogue about indigenous people, their history, and today, and they have become the part of the curriculum also, and the various educational events, other events they are taking place, because it has created a very much required awareness. And whenever awareness is created, so there is a hope for solutions and the other efforts coming forward. Many Canadians are now informed about the effects of colonization, residential schools, and the racist attitudes they were there, and hence they can be corrected with the process of time, helped in creating awareness of past harms and changes needed in Canada, and significant changes in the way Canadians understand their own history, including Canada's treatment of Indigenous people, so which is very, very important. And a threshold has been created, which needs to be looked after and progressed further. And in this direction only, It is important to mention the United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of Indigenous People. And in 2019, British Columbia became the first jurisdiction in Canada to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Premium John Harvin called it a guide to ensure that reconciliation is lasting. However, since BC adopted UNDRIP, Indigenous people say that their rights have not been truly respected, and a lot more is required. And since it needs more efforts, leaders say that it includes a lack of consultation from government, lack of recognition of the rights on health and safety concerns, and similarly about resource projects on their own land. In this regard, I would like to talk about calls to action also. And in 2015, members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada presented the calls to action, and which have various target audiences. And call to action 92 is directed at the private sector, which has three components which deal with the economic and business and corporations, their things to require, which are required, and hence they are earmarked as the areas which have to be which need the attention of the policymakers and all around the people, stakeholders involved. Now, after talking a little about this reconciliation as such, I am coming to economic reconciliation. Traditional economic development tends to emphasize individual material health, often at the expense of community relationships or the health of the physical environment. But economic reconciliation aims to create meaningful partnerships and mutually beneficial opportunities. And of course, it should be a holistic, value-driven approach to attaining community economic prosperity. What are the key features of economic reconciliation? It is, again, not merely a theoretical exercise or a slogan to go. It's an inclusive process of developing shared understanding and agreed upon values. And here I would like to emphasize again on agreed upon values and understandings. Secondly, stimulating concrete action, such as creating businesses, modifying and building the environment, and strengthening institutional capacity to enhance shared prosperity. So that prosperity, whatever the country is achieving in terms of economic, social, and other gains of development and growth, there should be enhancement of prosperity with all the Canadians in an equal way. And the Indigenous communities, they are very much have right to have that share in the prosperity and growth and economic development. And how it can be done, it can be built upon local heritage and positioning communities within the broader concepts. The benefits of economic trade at regional and international levels are widely recognized and accepted, that their fruits have to be there within all the communities. Therefore, we can say that economic reconciliation is a form of reconciliation in action. It aims at material prosperity. And of course, it's a holistic approach and multi-faced, and it should be influencing every aspect of life. Now, coming to a very important part of economic reconciliation, the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, which was established in 1990. The National Board is appointed by Order in Council to provide policy and program advice to the federal government on the issue. It's comprised of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community and business leaders from across Canada. The board plays an important role in helping the federal government to develop and then implement the policies and programs that respond to the unique needs and circumstances of the Aboriginal Canadians. The board also provides a vital link between policymakers, federal departments, and Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal businesses and community leaders, which is very, very important. Next is the Aboriginal Economic Benchmarking Report, which was there in 2012. And what were its objectives? To present comparative information on the economic standing of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, to identify variations among marginal heritage groups, which are there, First Nations, Inuit and Métis, and where possible between on and off reserve First Nations, to inform policy and program direction under the federal framework for economic development, and to provide a baseline and set targets. So which is very important, setting the targets against which trends and progress in Aboriginal economic development can be measured over time. And what are the core indicators which were decided? There are three core indicators. One is employment, and the other is income, and third is wealth and well-being. Three core indicators that are centered to measure the true economic progress of the First Nations and the communities. These require particular focus by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal leaders to close the socio-economic gaps. So closing the socio-economic gaps is very, very important between the people, Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal Canadians. So employment has three aspects. As such, employment, labor force participation, Aboriginal labor force participation, and of course, when we are talking about employment, we should also be aware of the unemployment, so total in numbers and hence how much percentage. Then income received through transfers and originated income from the sectors of the society. Then wealth and the well-being, which is measured with the help of community well-being index, which has its own parameters and components. And literally in the later half of this talk, later part of the talk, I'm going to talk about that too in detail, a little detail. Now, the board expects that as better data becomes available over time, the number of underlying indicators and measures that are tracked will increase. So three main indicators, but underlying indicators as and when the more data are available, and that is systematically arranged and tabulated and made to be used. It is on education, number two, entrepreneurship and business development and governance, lands and resources and infrastructure. And education-wise, it includes high school completion, university completion, then entrepreneurship and business development is self-employment of Aboriginal people, then profit and revenue of Aboriginal owned businesses, which is very important. Then governance, for that underlying indicator, it includes First Nations community intervention status, First Nations property taxation status. So these are two parts of the governance process as an underlying indicator. Then lands and resources, Land Management Act, First Nations Land Management Act, and second is comprehensive land claim and self-government agreements, of course, which are very, very important to have the trust and to have the goodwill and to really aiming at the economic social development of the people. Then fifthly is infrastructure, again, which is very important because it is one of the challenges faced by the Indigenous communities, because they do not have the basic human rights and the basic facilities like access to clean drinking water, and there is overcrowding with the housing and other areas, connectivity and off-grid communities. So these are the underlying indicators. What are the recommendations of the board? They are focus, number one, focus on First Nations reserves. Second is education, very important, and then employment and skill training, which can go forward enhancing the economic growth of the nations. Then community development, business development is of course part of it. Then youth and their various socio-economic problems, maybe like suicides or maybe the other ills, substance consumption or lack of education and other unrest due to the various reasons listed above. They should be taken care of in a good way with the participation from economic and business and societal angles. And data collection is, of course, very important because performance of the past goes for current policy making, and the future policy making depends upon the data collection, how good that data has been collected and how it is used. Then the board's 2016-2019 strategic plan, which is there, it focuses on 5 key priorities again in the line: enhancing Indigenous community readiness for economic opportunities, access to capital, building stable revenues for them, building the economic potential of our lands, and minimizing environmental impact. So environmental impacts are very, very important in this context. Supporting Indigenous businesses, again, which is very primary concern, which should be the primary concern of the all stakeholders, promoting the importance of Indigenous economic development. Then 2019 economic progress report concluded in this line only the various yearly reports whenever they were formed. They had their publications available. Number one, gains in some areas of Indigenous economic development participation were there. Then rapid growth of Indigenous entrepreneurs is required. Rising college graduation rates. There are certain very hopeful directions and indications in this area. Now, National Indigenous Economic Development Board 2023 strategic plan, it has 4 priority areas. So priority area number 1 is developing a national Indigenous economic strategy. So the emphasis on national, so it is nation-wise, and which incorporates all the plugs together. Priority area 2, advancing economic reconciliation. So whatever methods have been previously done to carry them forward and advancing them. Regional economic development for Indigenous peoples is also required, depending upon the region-wise their habitat, and closing the data gap on key Indigenous economic indicators is again very, very essential in that direction. Now I'm coming to very again interesting part of my talk, that is Community Wellbeing Index and its components. It has 4 components. Number 1 is education, labor force activity, income, and housing, and this index ranges from 0 to 100. It measures socio-economic well-being for communities across Canada over the time. Indigenous Services Canada, Government of Canada, Statistics Canada is the source for this, and it was calculated at cross sections, which is not time series, for 81, 91, 96, 2001, 2006, 2016. And the Canada Census of Population, they are also a part of the data for it. Currently, CWB scores for First Nations, Inuit, and non-Indigenous communities are calculated using the Statistics Canada Geographic Unit Census Subdivision. Each First Nations or Inuit community is designated by 1 or more census subdivisions. And it does not create a score for Métis communities, as there are only 8 Métis community designated settlement areas in Alberta, a smaller level of geography than this. So the next slide is about the regional analysis and the results of this CW index. And First Nation communities in the Atlantic region and the territories experienced the highest average CWB scores in 2016, so which is heartening. Then Prairie provinces experienced the lowest average CWB score. So here the policy makers, they can have their focused attention, and but it demonstrated certain greatest improvements since 2011. Also, the number of First Nation communities with a low CWB score means, which is less than 50 points, has declined dramatically since 1981, which is heartening thing. This decline represents a substantial shift in the range of CWB scores, and it also indicates that socioeconomic well-being has improved in the First Nations communities concerned to some extent with the efforts which are being made. And but this CWB index, it's pertain to only some of the socioeconomic well-being, but it is excluding some of the important aspects of human wealth and the other aspects around. These are 3 main major aspects. Number 1 is physical and emotional health, then cultural continuity, environmental conservation, which have to be supplemented along with this. Then the limitations of this CW index, these are given by the Office of the Auditor General. And it says that it does not fully capture the economic realities of some First Nations and Inuit communities. And there are many for example, it can be said that many are still heavily involved in traditional economic pursuits rather than diversifying their economic outlook and the source of income. Many indigenous communities have non-indigenous residents, and it influences overall CWE scores at the community and regional levels. It is not necessarily the only or best way to measure the well-being in all circumstances. Then policy implications of the sub-CWB index. More in-depth socioeconomic research is required to determine the key drivers for these trends, as well as the implications of these gaps for First Nations communities. And the encouraging trends of 2016 results indicate that gaps still are there between the First Nations and non-Indigenous communities, but these gaps are significant in size, that they were similarly observed in previous cycles of CW the index. So a lot more has to be is required in the area. Then what are the challenges? Challenges are that many reserves still do not have access to basic human rights like cleaning, drinking water, safety, and education rights that other Canadians enjoy. Second is a marked imbalance in the level of healthcare. So healthcare and education would remain all the time the basic socioeconomic infrastructure facilities, which are very important for the communities and which enhances the levels of productivity and the well-being in the society and economy. Then a marked imbalance in the level of healthcare, including earlier deaths and tilted power distribution. So again, a very important thing, so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people do not arrive at the table as peers, but as have they should be arriving at table as peers, but not as haves and have-nots. Indigenous people are still overrepresented in the justice system. Canadian government continues to take Indigenous people to court over their assertion of their rights and titles. So again, this has to be remedied in the future policy making. Now, I'm not calling it solutions, because these are some of the suggestions and approaches towards creating solutions. So I have named it solution-based approach. The first in this direction is supporting Indigenous communities, that is sharing economic opportunities and their industry engagement with the Indigenous people, collaboration on environmental protection, monitoring and management, then Canada's oil and natural gas industry enhancement and with Indigenous participation and initiatives such as education, scholarships, training programs, best fitting the local priorities. So local priorities are very important, identified by Indigenous communities. By working together, the industry can have a positive and lasting impact, including in support of economic reconciliation. Then community partnerships are very important. And in this regard, I would like to mention Canadian Social Economy Research Partnerships. And it says that researchers and Indigenous community members across the country have had the opportunity to work together to explore potential of the social economy to stimulate locally directed positive changes in diverse cultural and socio-economic contexts. So here I have mentioned social economy. Now coming a little in detail about little features about that. So social economy, again, it's a social-based approach, solution-based approach. It includes social assets like housing, child care, etc., social enterprises, including cooperatives, then credit unions, and equity enhancement, then debt capital for community investment, then social purposes businesses which take care of the local initiatives and local skills, community training and skill development, again focused for the people. We are talking about integrated social and economic planning, capacity building and community empowerment. Then Canadian Community Economic Development Network, it defines again institution which defines social economy, that there are many definitions used by practitioners and others interested in the social economy, but National Policy Council has the following definition, that social economy consists of association-based economic initiatives founded on values of service to members of the community rather than generating profits. So it should not be commercial, but service to the community is important priority to be taken care of. Then autonomous management and not government or market controlled businesses and economic pursuits, democratic decision making, primacy of persons and work over capital based on principles of participation and empowerment, which is very important. Now coming to the conclusions. The past policy framework and paternalism policies must be remedied in the future for future fruits and growth. Then substantial work is required on education, self-government, healthcare delivery, indigenous intellectual property rights, housing strategies. And it's not an easy way. There is no easy way to undo the history of multi-generational traumas which were faced. But resilience remains a key element in indigenous lives. Indigenous achievements in business, governance, cultural expression, community renewal, and reassertion of indigenous women in national affairs have succeeded despite daunting priorities, which is a good thing, and hence it should be carried forward. Now, I would I'm at the end of my talk, but I would like to just talk a little about the indigenous researchers. There is a Sandalin Gid, and she says that reconciliation means that reconciling, and which was earlier good. But she says, according to her, that the relationship has never been good, so it should be taken care of while talking about reconciliation. So it is her acknowledgement that there were wrongs, but there is a lot of action is also attached to it. Then again, another researcher in the area says, Joanna Mills, she says that before reconciliation in Canada can happen, Canadians need to educate themselves, and there must be more equality for Indigenous people. And all the things should be advanced and in letter and spirit. With this, I end my talk, and thank you very much for giving me platform and such a participation, which makes me happy, because although I'm not from my original background, having Indigenous background, but as a member of community, I have seen the structural oppression in my homeland and in my profession and various walks of life. And my heart goes for all the people and all the Canadians to have a better future, which is shared with all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inderpal. We'll open it up just for one or two questions, since we're running a little bit over time here. So if anyone wants to put anything into the Q&A section.
Let me just go to that. So it is in the chat probably.
I don't see anything in the Q&A.
Yes.
But perhaps if someone has a question after the fact, they could send their question to researchoffice@algomau.ca, and we would be able to forward that on to Inderpal.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'll definitely do that. My pleasure. Have a wonderful day all ahead. Thank you so much.
And we look forward to learning more about this important work. So next up, thank you. So next up, we have a group presentation from Dr. Vivian Jimenez-Estrada, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and the academic lead, Indigenization, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and two Nordic Institute researchers, Zachary and Samantha Harris. So I'll pass it on to them for their presentation titled Community and Indigenous Research, Commonalities to Apply a Strengths-Based Approach. And we haven't prepped yet with them, so I'm not sure if they'll be sharing their screen.
Yes, we will be. It's up. You need to enable screen sharing, please. Also, my video is disabled.
Could you do that from your end?
Yep, Vivian, I just gave you access. You should see something pop up.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so I don't think I have my video on. There we go. Good morning, everybody. As I say in my language, Zachary. My name is Dr. Vivian Jimenez-Estrada, and I will be just introducing this presentation right now, and then we'll introduce ourselves. So our presentation today will tease out how community-based research and Indigenous research can work together, while keeping in mind that Indigenous communities and organizations are increasingly calling for academics and institutions to support their efforts to continue to create the research structures that Indigenous communities need to enhance self-determination. So an example of this partnership, which we will talk about, is the example of a project that is driven by the female-led and Indigenous-led Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force of Bawating, who partnered with Nordic Institute to ensure that the collaboration and the maintenance of meaningful relationships and equitable partnerships between researchers and community members in all stages of the process are met. We know that we have been researched to death, and therefore this presentation will provide an example of how, if we begin not by analyzing and starting from a deficit perspective, but actually enhancing and supporting the strengths of both individuals and communities, which is inherent in Indigenous research, we can come to a collective potential solution that actually undoes many of the historical legacies of colonialism. So these actually carves a new path forward. I just want to also mention that Indigenous peoples have always done research. We have always searched for understanding, for ways of being and knowing the world around us in order to survive. And these are the words of Chief Norman Bone of Hisekoven First Nation. And he also says that we just didn't call it research. We call it something else in our own languages. So that's really important. So right now I am going to pass it over to Sam, who will introduce herself, and then Zach. And then after that, we will discuss some key principles of community-based research, then key principles of Indigenous research, and then we will go on to explain how these were applied in a project called the Restorative Justice Project. So I'll hand it over to Sam right now.
Thank you, Vivian. My video is not working as well, but I can go ahead. Ani Bajo, Samantha Harris, Dijnakas, Wawaskana ni Nishnabe Noswin, Makwa Dodem, Rekle Mintwobe, Otwajan, and Pelche Gitsi Mak. Wikwam Gong Donjaba Bakting Nadao. My name is Samantha Harris. Flower is my spirit name. And I'm part of the Bear Clan and acknowledge my grandparents of the Rekle, Pelche, Mantwalbe, and Tawajan Lewis family. I'm a proud Anishinaabe woman, member of the Wakumakong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, and currently making my home here in Bawading, Sault Ste. Marie. I am the Indigenous Youth Justice Liaison working with this, as a researcher with this collaboration team in partnership with the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force, Nordic Institute, and the Indigenous-led Bawading Justice Committee. I do find myself quite new to Indigenous research as a formal study and appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this team. Miigwech, and I'll pass it along to Zach.
Zach, if you're here, I don't see you in the list of panelists, so you may be listed under attendees under a different name. So I'm not sure. Oh, I'm not sure.
I'll fix it because I think I'm the host now. 1 second. Sorry. There we go. Oh my, how can I see this? There we go. Oh, I don't see Zach here. Oh, attendees. There we go. Zach, can you turn on your sound now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Zachary Lowe. I'm Community-Based Justice Project Coordinator with the Nordic Institute. I'm also a graduate of the Community Economic and Social Development Program from Algoma U. I am a privileged male settler living and working on the Robinson Huron traditional treaty lands of the Anishinaabe and Métis peoples in Bawating. I am committed to being an unsettled settler ally through critical self-reflection and mindfulness, through interpersonal relationships, humility, taking an unsettling and uncomfortable approach to daily life, and by engaging in solidarity work with the indigenous initiatives and movements. I'm working with this justice initiative because it is an opportunity to challenge the systemic issues of the current criminal justice system and to work on community-based solutions that focus on healing, restoration, and reconciliation. Thank you, Miigwech, for having me this morning.
Thank you, and I will go ahead and introduce myself now. So Vivian Jimenez-Estrada Lenubi, Pai Shimuleo, Paletina Rabinal, Chanin Pa Bawating Hainkowi, Maltes Chiwe, and I just introduced myself in my language, which is in Maya Achi, and stayed in my community and territory, the land of corn, otherwise known as Guatemala. I currently live on Robinson Huron territory, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, particularly the Batchewana and Garden River First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation, and acknowledge with respect the presence of other Indigenous nations who also reside in Bawating, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. So my involvement in this project is actually as lead researcher, guided by my own personal experience and responsibilities as a Maya Achi woman, as a mother, as a sister, as a daughter, as a granddaughter. Living outside of my traditional territory, also as an academic that supports Indigenous communities' efforts to center self-determination and restore balance. I am deeply and continuously mindful of how mine and other Indigenous cultural frameworks overlap, intersect, and differ from those communities with whom I work. I'm also a founding member of the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force, and I also teach sociology from Indigenous perspectives at Algoma University, where I am an associate professor in sociology and also a Nordic research associate. So we will go ahead now and begin with a discussion of community-based research. Go ahead, Zach.
Thank you, Vivian. Community-based research is sometimes referred to as action research or participatory research or community-based participatory research. But it has a core philosophy of inclusivity and of engaging the community members in the research itself. Community-based research is a collaborative approach that is designed to ensure and establish structures for participation by communities affected by the issue being studied, representatives of organizations and researchers in all aspects of the research process to address an issue through taking action, including social change. The foundations of community research is built on the foundation of social justice and empowerment, with its roots in feminist theory and community organizing. There is knowledge and benefit in the shared partnership between academia and community, where local knowledge is an important component of the research process. Community-based research is based on ideas of inclusivity, multiple perspectives and ways of knowing, and acknowledgement that research is not value-free. Community-based research is a continuum. Community-engaged research exists on a continuum ranging from research in the community setting to research that really fully engages community partners in the process. The goal of community-based research is really to create ways that increase shared connections between academics and communities. The principles of community research are that it acknowledges community as a unit of identity to understand the identity that communities are made up of people linked by social ties who share common perspectives or interests. It builds on strengths and resources within the community through its members who participate in the process and bring in a variety of skill sets that are different than but equally as valuable as academic skills. Community-based research facilitates a collaborative, equitable partnership in all phases of research involving an empowering and power sharing process that attends to social inequalities. It fosters co-learning and capacity building among its partners. It integrates and achieves a balance between knowledge generation and intervention for the mutual benefit of all partners. It disseminates results to all partners that involves them in the wider dissemination of results. The dissemination needs to benefit all parties. Community-based research involves a long-term process and commitment to sustainability. And ultimately, community-based research approaches have much to contribute to research that is responsible, respectful, reciprocal, and relevant.
Thank you, Zach. So the next section, we're going to delve a little bit into what has been emphasized throughout this research week, and it is Indigenous research. Now, in this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about how Indigenous research is inherently community-based. So in emphasizing some elements that overlap with community-based research, specifically in respect to the generation of the research process, Indigenous communities for Indigenous research are involved from the ideation to the research design and interpretation, the implementation through to the research dissemination. So that's very much like community-based research. What is really important to emphasize about the values that guide this particular type of research is that these are inherent Indigenous values. And in 1991, Vera Kirkness, along with Barnhart, wrote some initial papers that began to circulate amongst the academic community that talked about the Indigenous values that should guide an Indigenous research framework. And those are their values such as respect, relevance, responsibility, and reciprocity. And Wilson enhanced on these in 2001 and then again in 2008 by adding relationality to the list. Indigenous research also emphasizes community, so the collective versus the individual. And in this, it also accounts for relational accountability, which are founded which are the founding principles of things such as OCAP principles, the ownership, control, access, and protection of data, and the UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that firmly states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. So Indigenous research requires that Indigenous processes are honored, respected, manifested, and articulated through Indigenous worldviews. In this sense, Indigenous research is not only about the outputs and the outcomes, but is actually also very much centered about the process. And this process should engage meaningful and collaborative community partnerships to ensure that it is a community-driven research project that supports the self-determination through what has been coined as two-eyed seeing. So next slide. Okay. So some of those key principles are also guided by Indigenous teachings. And what is really unique about our project is that myself coming from Mayan territory, and really linking with the some of the teachings from this territory, Anishinaabe teachings, we want to talk about how there's teachings about living the good life and how to get there. And Sam is now going to talk about this Anishinaabe concept of Mino Bimatsawin, and then I will jump in to talk about my own understanding of how this can be applied from my own perspective and my understanding, which is my own concept, the Mayan concept of Hun Winak. So I'll pass it over to Sam.
Miigwech Vivian. So Mino Bimatsawin, Living the Good Life, illustrates a comprehensive Anishinaabe worldview and ontology expressing the place of the Anishinaabe with spirit and human beings. Indigenous scholars have demonstrated the significance of locating oneself and being fundamental to Indigenous research and our lives. So Dr. Raven Sinclair of the Wichitan Aboriginal Social Work in Canada suggests that location in Indigenous research, as in life, is a crucial starting point. The significance of locating oneself and where we come from as Anishinaabe people and where our roots begin is to live Mino Bimatsawin, where we must return to the teachings, to the way of understanding and speaking Anishinaabe. So Bishkabe Young, the return to our teachings is the first step in becoming, the process of being Anishinaabe. With an onset of colonialism the meaning of Minobamadzwin has shifted to include relationships with the settler society and has been referred to as guiding principles within research, and remind researchers that in Guamzinda, which means being careful and determined in our collective efforts to learn about and live our lives in a good way. Next slide. So the 7 principles of Minobamadzwin, the Anishinaabe Minobamadzwin, is guided by these 7 principles. They do not belong exclusively to the Anishinaabe. They are the original teachings of all nations on Turtle Island. They have been developed to help define who we are, who the Anishinaabe are as original people, including the language, worldview, and as a way to honor the Anishinaabe nation. These 7 principles are foundational to Anishinaabe identity. So number 1 being the Anishinaabe Muin, our language, Non-Dedzuin, taking care of oneself, Nendamuin, our mind, Zichigewin, the way we do things, Nakedawin, taking care, Gikenda Bumang, Gida Ke Benang is steering into the right direction. And then Gikendaswin is the way of knowing and knowledge. In this project, the principles of Minobamadzwin helped guide the research and also provided some parameters and common sense of understanding of research, which governs how Indigenous communities and research define their activities. The Anishinaabe Minobamadzwin, so living the good life again, is also unifying and transcendent concept that, when activated, contains the past, present, and future of good and respectful approaches to life, which includes Indigenous research. Through this work, we centered a spirit-centered way that highlights how Minobamadzwin leads to Nangdada Gikendaswin, which means let's follow the path to knowledge and put into practice the teachings that have been given to us. Now, Vivian will discuss the concept that guides her work into Wanwanak.
Sam. So the concept that you see here, you'll see it illustrated. This is actually a picture of one of our textiles. It's a woven cloth that we actually use as a skirt. And in this cloth, you'll see that there's in the middle, I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually the tree of life. The tree of life has 4 directions. And if you see it going down, it's actually connected through the trunk to the roots. What this indicates, actually, the 4 people above and the 4 people below, is a connection to the past, present, future. It's also a connection between all of the dimensions that we understand from our own worldview as being connected and always influencing one another. The 4 original peoples that are above and the 4 original peoples that are below are always in constant relationship. So starting at the center, you can see that there's an individual and the tree connecting everybody at the top and the bottom. So we are connected to one another through our families, our extended families, our communities, our regions, our nations, and the entire universe. And the tree of life is that conduit. So this concept actually comes from the Quiche word hun, which translates to number 1, and winak, which actually translates into being. So therefore, the concept alludes to a process of becoming whole or a complete being through our spiritual practices. The hun winak is based on the teaching of our creation story called the Pop Buch, that attests that attaining balance requires awareness of our relations and relationships and the hope to heal, particularly when seeking to find balance amongst ourselves and all our relations. I share this concept as it continues to guide the research that I engage with and my actions daily. And it also demonstrates how Indigenous research centers guiding principles that connect diverse Indigenous peoples and that guide our way of doing and being, including the research processes. And as I understand it, it very much relates to the concept of Minobamadzwin. Now, we can see that the project stemmed from the identified needs of community and applying a combination of community-based research alongside Indigenous research methodologies demonstrate that the two can work together. However, I must caution everyone that we are always, always aware, and we have to be ready to continuously engage in meaningful dialogue to ensure that all participants are clear on the needs and goals of the communities that the research serves. So in this way, Indigenous research pushes researchers to always be reflexive, humble, and be ready to make mistakes and be open to new ways of furthering Indigenous self-determination. This next graphic that I'll show you actually demonstrates, and this is adapted from Linda Tuhiwai-Smith in 2012, her book Indigenous Research Methodologies that was first published in 1999. And it actually shows through the this particular connection of spiraling circles, how self-determination needs to be centered and how we need to begin from decolonizing political, social, spiritual, psychological structures and ways of being, so that we can then engage in a mobilization at every single level, so that we can begin transformation at the psychological, social, political, economic level, and through collective change, so that we can achieve healing on all levels. And of course, we also can see that often when we have been asked to participate in research as Indigenous peoples, often the first thing that has come through those projects has been a way to only survive, right? So if you peel back that layer and you go deeper, you can see that actually these partnerships are not just about survival and material well-being. It actually is a process whereby it can facilitate the recovery of those things that have always been targeted by colonization to be taken away from us, so that you can develop those tools that can allow you to continue focusing on self-determination and how to heal from those wounds. So I just wanted to show that as a segue into talking now about how the project Restorative Justice Anti-Racism Youth Diversion Initiative actually does try to bring in those two approaches for the support and well-being of local communities. So I'll pass it over to Zach.
Which Vivian, yeah, the Restorative Justice Anti-Racism Youth Diversion Initiative is what we are collectively working on, and began as a coming together of two organizations. First, the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force, which is an Indigenous women-led network of organizations and community members with the vision to restore the honor and sacredness of Indigenous women by ending all forms of violence. The task force conducted community strategic planning sessions to identify objectives and goals for 2018 to 2023. And one of the objectives identified from these planning sessions was to implement, advocate, and educate about alternative community-based justice processes for Indigenous perpetrators of violence. The Nordic Institute was approached to support the funding submission and to work collaboratively with the task force based on its past experience with community research and development. Together, the task force and Nordic Institute secured funding through Heritage Canada's Anti-Racism Action Program, which is a component of Canada's anti-racism strategy. The application was one of fewer than 90 successful applications across Canada from over 1,000 submissions, and is a 2-year project that promotes a dialogue on community-based justice processes and strategies for diverting Indigenous peoples from incarceration. It's taking a local approach to restorative justice, specifically for urban Indigenous youth aged 12 to 29. And we are currently at the primary data gathering stage through conducting interviews and focus groups. The project's goals are to promote greater collaboration between Indigenous community services and non-Indigenous organizations in order to improve outcomes for Indigenous youth who have interactions with the justice system. It also aims to build restorative justice capacity by coordinating training around anti-racism, cultural safety, restorative justice to Indigenous community service providers and non-Indigenous service providers working in the justice system. And the overall goal is to develop a framework for a community-based justice model that can be implemented in Bawating. So how are we taking actions to achieve these goals? Firstly, conducting literature reviews on best practices in restorative justice, as well as identifying current and historical approaches for Indigenous justice interventions and community-based justice models. We conducted an environmental scan to determine what community-based justice models and restorative justice practices exist locally and what is comparable regionally. Then there was the establishment of the Bawating Justice Committee. And this Indigenous-led collaboration is tasked with building culturally appropriate restorative approaches for members of the community involved in the criminal justice system. The Bawating Justice Committee guides and is inclusive of every aspect of this initiative. The work began with dialogue on a local community-based justice model for Indigenous community members, an environmental scan of existing practices of restorative justice with the goal of increasing the capacity of all service providers in the justice system to contribute to more equitable outcomes for Indigenous communities. The Bawating Justice Committee is composed of representatives from the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force, the Sault Ste. Marie Indigenous Friendship Center, the Métis Nation of Ontario, Non-Dewindamin Family Community Services, Anishinaabe Police Services, Batchewana First Nation Health Center, Garden River First Nation Wellness Center, Wabanong Head Start Family Resources, Mawasay North Shore Community Health Services, Algoma Treatment and Remand Center, and as well as the school boards. Out of the Bawating Justice Committee, there's a subcommittee that acts in a research advisory role. And this committee works closely with both Vivian, myself, and Sam, as well as Nordic's director, Dr. Sean Meadis, to provide oversight in all aspects of the research, from methodology to the methods development, participant outreach and engagement, and will provide oversight on final reporting as well. The project focused on a variety of community engagement activities, including outreach to Indigenous service program providers, organizations, and staff who all work in the justice system. Engagement also included Indigenous and non-Indigenous service providers, legal professionals, and local elders and knowledge keepers who have had experiences with the justice system to identify gaps and needs in the community. Once our research ethics board submission was approved, the primary data collection and the gathering of stories began. And then at the same time, we welcomed Samantha Harris as the Indigenous Youth Justice Liaison. It has greatly benefited from her lived experience as Anishinaabe. I will turn it over to Sam now, who will go over the community-based and Indigenous research methods that were chosen for this project.
Thank you much, Zach. So the art project came about as a way to engage youth in a creative and youth-friendly manner in order to build the relationship necessary to engage in dialogue about restorative justice and what justice means to young people in the community. This approach not only provided a way to build relationships with the youth, but also with the service providers and staff to work with the youth. Through this engagement, youth were provided with the opportunity to become involved with the initiative, and even further by participating in individual interviews and sharing circles. Youth were then provided with a 5x7 canvas and art supplies that they needed, and asked to write down one word what justice meant to them. They were provided some examples as well as some information about what justice meant to them, about what we mean when we are talking about the justice system. Youth were then able to decorate their canvas however they wanted, using whatever medium they had available to them. Some of the youth knew exactly what justice meant to them. Some had no idea what justice meant and what the justice system was, and did need more information and time to reflect, for reflection on their art piece. Staff also noted to us that in some cases, the process led to a great discussion amongst the youth about their experience with the justice system or with justice in general. So far, 30 youth have participated in the art project, 6 have participated in the individual interviews, and a handful have expressed interest in the sharing circles. Youth have participated in, from the Kinawea program, the Dantu Center, the Algoma Treatment and Remand, the Sault Ste. Marie Indigenous Friendship Center, and we are still working out the logistics on both the Huron Superior Catholic District School Board and the Algoma District School Board as well. So with the interviews and the sharing circles, it was determined within the project that individual interviews will be conducted to explore experiences and knowledge of the youth criminal justice system in order to assess the needs and barriers in the community that a community-based justice model could potentially address. Sharing circles amongst peer groups will be shared brainstorming discussions to explore local gaps and needs in the communities, what one's personal experience has been with the justice system and what did or could not have helped them, and what possibilities exist as an alternative to the justice system. These methods also offer a way to discover community strength and opportunities for collaboration and to focus on taking action to improve outcomes for youth and to strengthen the capacity for service providers working with the justice system. With that, the interviews explored three thematic areas. Why factors leading to a young person in becoming involved with the justice system. The what is the knowledge and understanding of the criminal justice system, restorative justice, and what are some possibilities? The how, meeting the needs of the youth in a culturally sound way as a mean prevention. And with myself as a person who identify as a Anishinaabe Kwe, trying to create that safety and connection with the youth or with any of the participants by referring to the 7 guiding principles of Minoba Mazawin. And during the interviews, we had 6 youth interviewed, 7 service providers, legal professionals, 3 elders or knowledge keepers so far, and with more to come over the next couple of weeks. The interviews and sharing circle process will lend the community a voice to what a community-based justice framework will look like in Bawading. We are currently still in the research process of conducting interviews and planning stages for sharing circles. It is our hope to publicly display the community art pieces, the art project with the community come springtime. We are hoping to disseminate this research by planning and hosting a one-day conference to recap this initiative that will include identifying the Bawading Justice Committee and supports available in Bawading. An information session on community-based and restorative justice models, the state of the justice system in Algoma, statistics of Indigenous incarceration in Algoma, and a gala of networking and promotion of a positive relationship with mainstream stakeholders and the justice workers and Indigenous service providers as well.
Thank you. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about Tuaitsi because this is a concept that was actually proposed by Mi'kmaq elders Albert and Mordina Marshall as a way to bridge Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And we feel that this is exactly what the project is actually doing. It's bridging the two to work together in order to meet the needs identified and led by the community. So as we have demonstrated through this general overview of the project, combining community-based research and Indigenous research has provided an opportunity to apply them both. Also, the project demonstrates how to center and begin from the strength, knowledge, wisdom, and power of collaboration and collective ways of being of the Indigenous communities that we serve and work with. Now I'm going to pass it over to Sam, just to give us a bit of what a strength-based approach is in a nutshell.
Yeah, so the strength-based approach as the basis for conducting research with and for Indigenous communities recognizes the strength of individuals and communities, which mean engaging them as leaders or partners in work in which they can define and pursue their own wellness goals and outcomes. In many ways, Indigenous and community-based research methodologies share common goals and practices, even if they originate from different worldviews and theories. Both may value reflective, relational, and interpretative processes, but they do center self-determination and healing. I'll pass along to Zach on what to expect.
Yeah, so some considerations when conducting community-based and Indigenous research. One being that it takes time. time to build relationships with partners, time to manage a participatory group, and time beyond specific projects to maintain partnerships. Time is a resource that is always limited, but not always accounted for. And sometimes the process is more important than the outcomes and outputs. Balancing the demands of community action with the needs of research can be challenging. Pacing may differ, analytic methods may clash, and dissemination efforts may conflict. Be ready to engage with new participants and actors. Given that the contextual environment is constantly changing, there may be difficulties maintaining partnerships as priorities shift and personnel change within the community. Expect continuous and meaningful dialogue to ensure all participants are clear on the needs and goals of the communities the research serves. And always be ready to be reflexive, humble, and embrace making mistakes, but always come back to centering Indigenous self-determination for the collective good.
Thanks, Zach. So just some closing thoughts and to further those recommendations is that, you know, these the support for these research approaches to address the needs for balanced, culturally grounded, self-determining ethical research with Indigenous peoples require more than meets the eye. You know, without having a particular framework or established processes within an institution, you know, the researchers themselves have to take it upon themselves and be very mindful and develop those tools to build the relationships and meaningfully engage Indigenous peoples in order to understand, support, and adhere to local ethical guidance protocols that may not yet be formalized in Western institutions and research approaches, which needs time. I can't emphasize that enough. You really, really need time. So institutions really need to provide that adequate time and support for researchers to build and maintain those relationships, because it is foundational to doing this particular type of research in a good way. And those relationships are maintained beyond the life of the research project. They will last a lifetime if done well. So miigwech, and this is just a little, you know, what is in our cup, in our coffee cup, because we like coffee. And it's basically a lot of the things that kind of overlap with both approaches. You can see that community research, time, relationships, and Indigenous respect for communities. Respect for Indigenous communities is something that overlaps, but then there's like the little tiny details that are also very distinct between the two, and we have to always be mindful in terms of what those differences are and how both approaches may diverge or converge. So thank you very much for your time, and we are now going to open it to questions if you have any. Miigwech to everyone, miigwech to Sam, miigwech to Zach, and go ahead, Tiff.
So I'm going to jump in here, Vivian. It's Sarah. So we do have one question in the chat that I'll read out loud, and then I'll let you and the other panelists respond. So it's, we know that decolonization has and continues to be intercepted by the neoliberal plan. Social work is well known in terms of how it applies cultural competency as a method of providing services to clients, all in the name of community development. This has been marked as a new form of racism that forgets histories of racism and colonialism. How does your research reconcile corporate decolonization?
Sorry, that is, thanks, Dio. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it's a lot of things. Keep in mind that we're trying to decolonize institutions that are inherently colonial with processes that don't always lend themselves to allowing for both the time to be reflexive, to adjust if it's needed. And in that regard, a corporate decolonization would really be welcome because it would mean that we're no longer abiding by timelines. We're no longer abiding by particular processes that actually prevent the meaningful participation of people and their remuneration, right? There's particular rules around honoraria and when you begin to pay tax and what to declare, what not. So all of these things actually sometimes run counter to what is needed to create those meaningful relationships. And it's something that, again, each individual researcher has to navigate very carefully. And in the process, we may or may not lose participants. We may or may not lose trust. We may have to rebuild relationships again from square one. Requires a lot of discussion and engagement. Yeah, we always have those questions at the forefront, and we always have to deal with that. So I don't have an answer for you, but I think that each individual needs to just always keep learning, talk about and acknowledge your own privilege and how you can use that privilege to make the path to do things in a way that is required by those funders and by those institutions, while at the same time making sure that you are responding to community needs. So that's what I can say. Zach and Sam, if you have anything else to add, I'll welcome them.
I think that was very well put, Vivian. It's definitely something that is always at the forefront of these projects and considerations, and when working to meet community needs, always striving to challenge those systems of colonial structures and powers. So.
Yeah, and if I just can add one last thing, Samantha, do you have anything else to add?
Just a little bit about, being an Anishinaabe person and being part of this research, and, seeing those things as well is really an eye-opener for myself, coming from intergenerational trauma as well, with family and residential school, and connecting with the participants on a deeper level, as being part of a researcher, we're finding myself, really being almost emotionally involved and trying to defer these factors. And, Vivian answered it really, really well, in a sense where we can't, we don't have an answer just yet, but it's a learning curve for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question. This is from Brad and Amanda with Thrive Tours. It says, "Miigwech for all your work in deconstructing these social issues in the heart of Turtle Island. How do you suggest navigating the differences between Western philosophies while adhering to our holistic approach in a way where we feel honored and respected as equals?"
Miigwech for that question. It's always, I think, really important to remind yourselves who it is that we are serving through the research. I think part of what I appreciate about this process is the fact that, we have here with us Samantha and Zach, who work for Nordic Institute, who has a long tradition of supporting community-led initiatives, increasingly hiring, training students and researchers that often come from the Community Economic and Social Development Program, who have been trained within the classroom and through experiential courses and approaches to actually really think deeply about and critically about what it means to conduct research with Indigenous communities, and not lead the way, and really thinking about when it is that research can become paternalistic, imposing colonial, as opposed to leading through following. Leadership through following is it's a really important concept that has been part of my own Mayan cosmology, and that has been over and over, being heard by the Zapatista movement down in Chiapas, Mexico. But I think it's something that we all must remember, and that's one way to try to incorporate the two, take the best of the two. Because I think that, the more diversity in ways of thinking and approaching a particular issue, the better. And I think that that is what our teachings provide for us, right? It's a way to bringing everyone together, all minds in council, is what my ancestors say, right? To provide a better path forward for future generations. So much for that.
And it looks like we have one more question in the chat. from Rose. How do we walk the thin line of decolonization and representation without manifesting ontology of forgetting?
That's really deep, Rose. Zach or Sam, any thoughts on that? I'll try to. How do we walk the line of decolonize? So how do we try to decolonize without actually forgetting to do? I think that's what I'm understanding by your question, Rose. I think it's something that we have to continuously negotiate with ourselves. You know, every morning I wake up and and I engage in my own practice so that I can have guidance from my ancestors, so that I can do the best, not for me, not for my own personal gain, but for the betterment of communities and for the next 7 generations. So how do we do that? I think that we need to also take that responsibility upon ourselves to do it, to walk the talk and not just provide key concepts and key things so that we can get funding. I hope I've answered a little bit of that, but we can definitely engage in a further discussion. And if Sam or Zach would like to add.
Yeah, and just part of what I was discussing about Minobamazuin, just going into as researchers and, we represent that Minobamazuin is not only an Anishinaabe world anthology. It's for all peoples of all nations, of all cultures, and all and the peoples of where we live and where we enter into communities to do research. It's going into that mindset, and I think every day we kind of live in that sense. And Vivian couldn't answer it any better, in a sense where we're connecting to ourselves, in a sense of how, when we better ourselves, and when we better ourselves, or when we living the good life or the Minobamazuin, we're bringing that into our research. And when we are going into, like you, Rose, when you asked, walking that thin line, it's keeping that mindset of, living the good life, and in a sense where that's where we need to, again, keep reminding ourselves of that, within our own selves as researchers, and being part of entering these communities as well. I hope that answered that. Let me go ahead.
Thank you, Sam. So we just have some thanks here in the chat. So Rose has said thank you, and Narosha has said that was really insightful, so thank you so much. Dio said thank you for such a reflexive engagement, and Donna's also thanking you as well, Donna Rogers, our VPAR. And I'd like to thank you for being here today, to Vivian, Sam, and Zach, for discussing your research with us. It was a great collaborative approach to sharing your work. This presentation was amazing. And I'd also like to thank everyone who attended today's session. It's really important to listen to research here at Algoma U and see how well we're doing. So thank you for attending today's spotlight session. Our second lunchbox talk this week will begin in just shy of 15 minutes at 11:45. And tomorrow we'll host our Research Week 2022 Town Hall at 11 a.m. And we hope you'll join with one more lunchbox talk tomorrow following that from 12 to about 1:15 p.m. So that tomorrow will wrap up Algoma's second annual Research Week. And again, thanks for attending. And we hope to see you later today and at tomorrow's event. So thank you again to Vivian, Sam, and Zach. Any final words for everyone?
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much to the Research Office for this amazing event. I think it really highlights what we do as researchers and how we engage with community. Let's keep the conversation going. I think that as more faculty engage in deeply critical and engaged research, we have heard some amazing examples of what's going on in our institution. I think that, let's continue the conversation aside from just Research Week, and I would welcome my colleagues and peers who are doing this kind of work to come together and maybe some coffee talks once in a while so we can share strategies and figure out how to do this in a good way and continuing to do the good work that we all do. So miigwech, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Vivian. Thanks to everyone. I'll stop the recording now and let everyone hopefully attend our next lunchbox talk. Thank you.